There are moments in history that get carved into our collective memory. But then there are others, ones that are just as important, that somehow get pushed into the shadows. Today, we're talking about one of those moments, the Orangeburg Massacre, a tragedy from 1968 that has been overlooked for way, way too long.
Okay, so you've definitely heard of the Kent State shooting, right? 1970, National Guard kills 4 students protesting the war. But what about this? 2 years before that, state police in South Carolina opened fire on unarmed student protesters. They killed 3 and wounded 28. This was actually the first time students were killed during a protest on an American college campus. So why is one story remembered and the other so often forgotten?
To really understand what happened that night, we need to go deeper than just the facts and figures. We're going to see this whole story through the eyes of someone who was there, a survivor whose voice has been waiting to be truly heard for more than 50 years. This is Harold C. Riley. Back in 1968, he was just a sophomore at South Carolina State College. And his words, man, they just cut right through it all. No sugarcoating. He calls it exactly what it was, a massacre. His perspective is what's going to guide us through this history. So what could possibly lead to such a horrific event? Well, it all started with a simple, basic demand for dignity. And it's centered on, of all places, a local bowling alley. This is where the fuse was lit. The context here is so important. You have to remember, this is 1968. That's 4 full years after the Civil Rights Act made segregation illegal. But in Orangeburg, South Carolina, the local bowling alley, the All-Star Bowling Lane, just refused to integrate. For the students at the town's 2 historically black colleges, this wasn't really about bowling. It was about demanding the rights they were already supposed to have by law. And you can just see how quickly things spiraled. The first night, February 6th, the students protested peacefully, they were turned away, and that was it. But night 2, they came back and were met with police batons. By the 3rd night, the governor had called in the National Guard. What started as a peaceful protest had turned into this heavily armed standoff. I mean, just picture this scene. You've got 200 unarmed students huddled around a bonfire on their own college campus. They're singing to stay warm, and all around them, surrounding them, is an army of state police and National Guardsmen. The difference between those 2 groups is just staggering. The next 10 seconds would change everything. Forever. We're going to hear Harold Riley's own account of exactly what happened in that moment.
Riley remembers hearing a whistle, and he said it just sounded funny. It wasn't right. It was a signal.
And then, this. The sound of shotguns. Riley describes it with a simple, brutal sound. It was an overwhelming barrage of fire. He remembers diving behind a trash can as bullets were flying past him, ricocheting off things. Just the sound of absolute terror and chaos. The whole thing lasted for an estimated 8 to 10 seconds. That's it. In less time than it takes to even process what's happening, dozens of lives were completely shattered. When it was all over, 3 students were dead. And we need to remember their names. Henry Smith and Samuel Hammond Jr. Both were students at South Carolina State. And Delano Middleton, he was a 17-year-old high school student. He was just on campus, waiting for his mother to get off work. Harold Riley survived. And his memory of what came next is just pure horror. He describes stepping over bodies, surrounded by people screaming and crying, just running for his life. The shooting itself may have only lasted for a few seconds, but the fight for justice and the official cover-up, that would go on for decades. Almost immediately, a false story was created. Law enforcement claimed there was an exchange of gunfire, which put the blame on the victims. The Associated Press ran with that story. But the person who gave them that information, a photographer, he later admitted he never heard any shots coming from the students because they were unarmed. And this is what justice looked like. The 9 state troopers who admitted they fired their guns were charged, yes, but an all-white jury acquitted every single one. The only person who served jail time was Cleveland Sellers, a student activist who was actually wounded in the massacre. He was convicted of inciting a riot, and he was put in prison. It took 25 years for him to finally get a pardon. The legal cases might have closed, but for the survivors, the wounds, both the ones you can see and the ones you can't, have never really healed. Harold Riley was shot twice that night. Doctors were able to remove one of the bullets, but the other one is still there, lodged in his right knee, to this day. And he calls it his evidence, a permanent physical piece of that night that he carries with him every single day. And the deepest scar, it's the loss of his friends. He talks about the lives they never got to live, the families they never got to have. He says, "I'm a grandparent now, but they will never see that." It's just a powerful, heartbreaking reminder of the futures that were stolen. And maybe the most shocking thing of all, in over half a century, not a single person from the state of South Carolina has ever officially contacted Harold Riley to ask for his testimony. The silence from the state has been just as deafening as the gunfire was that night. Which leaves us all with this final, really important question. It's been more than 50 years. The event is history, but the pain and that silence, they're still very present. For the survivors, for the families of the young men who were killed, and for a piece of history that's been ignored for too long, what does justice truly look like now?